this computer. Okay, so we are recording. There should be one, three, four. There should be four more unless they're black. Okay, the name of our course is The World of the New Testament, the Life, the Customs, and the Times. This is get out my syllabus so that we will know. I know you probably got one. Everybody should have gotten one. It's basically dealing with the culture in which the New Testament characters live, the political, social, economical, and religious conditions are going to be studied. Special attention to certain things. If you need to talk with me, my telephone number is there, plus I have email, and I do email. You can send stuff on Facebook Messenger. I do that too. But I really prefer the email because I have a file for Georgia School of Preaching, and I can keep your email there. If you're taking it for credit, there are things that you have to do for credit, for 3 hours credit. You have to write weekly summaries of what they have read in the required text. If you look over in the syllabus, you'll find that I have outlined what's in the book, and that simply means that you need to go down through there, and I'm trying to make sure that I've got it divided up. It's divided up into, count the appendixes, it's broke up into 10 different lessons, and I have a lesson plan for myself that I've made from the book. I have a lesson plan that I have made from the book. Those of you who are taking the book for credit, the only way you'll get my notes is after I receive your notes. Those of you who are not taking it for credit, if you haven't bought the book, then what I've done is read the book, highlighted things in the book, and I've copied those out, and I have a lesson plan along with another book, which I'll hold up here. You notice it says Backgrounds to Early Christianity. This is by Brother Everett Ferguson. If you ever see this book, it is a great book. And then also there's another book, and I don't know if I pronounce this fellow's name, called The Daily Life in Ancient Rome. Let me turn it up like this so you see. It's a pretty good book if you want to just read what's going on in Rome. Those are the books that was on the syllabus, that we put on the syllabus for you to look at. If you'll notice there, you can get those books, Exploring the New Testament World. If you have Logos, I'll use Logos Bible software. You can get Albert Bell's book on Logos. Download it. I don't know if you can get it on eSword or anything of that sort, but you can buy the books at different places. The Christian bookstore, ebooks, $1.99 on Albert Bell's book. Christian Family Bookstore, $15, $13.8 plus shipping. This was suggested text, and that was the one, The Backgrounds of Early Christianity by Everett Ferguson. I bought that book because that was a book I was going to use. It's a third edition, but I decided to stay with Albert Bell and incorporate Brother Ferguson's book and what he has to say, and also this other book by Jerome Copino. I bought that book, and it's a good read, and so I'm trying to read them. Also, I have the IVP books on Bible background commentary and The New Manner and Customs of the Bible by James M. Freeman. And the reason we don't use that book is because they have a book, they have another class that uses that book. Come on in. Yeah. Y'all Brants, yes. Brants, Rita and Steve, yeah. Y'all come on in. And so that's the what you have to do. In other words, I was telling you what you had to do if you was taking it for credit. You have to write weekly summaries on what they have read in the required text. You try to stay up with me. It's an average of, I forget what the average was in this book, because we've got 18 meetings. So 18 into 300. So what's that? Less than 20 pages, isn't it? Yeah. So when you read, you need to make summaries, and you don't have to make long summaries of those chapters in that book, just as long as eventually at the end you've gotten everything in the book. And it's just that one book, because you don't have to have the other two. You just need that one book. You're taking it for credit. Also note some class which must be sent to me after each class. When you get through the night, you're to send me your class notes if you're taking it for a credit. And also you understand that, like we said, this is being streamed on Zoom to YouTube, and we'll send you after the class link so that you can go there. And if you want to listen to me twice, you can do that. If you want to listen to me every day, you can do that. And if something happens, you miss the class, then you can also go over there and pick that up. They're on there. They stay on there, as far as I know. I didn't take them off of all the courses I taught. So those will be on there. Also, you will have a midterm and a final test. And whatever you make is what you get. If you make 0, you get 0. We don't grade on the curve. 0 to 100. Then fourth of all, through your participation and discussion on various topics in class, we will follow the outline of the required text. Like we're just simply going to go through the book. I'm not reading all that book. I have copied stuff out of it, and sometimes it may be all the pages on one certain thing, but there's a lot of other things that Brother Ferguson in his book has done a better study on, and so we'll use it. Then at the very end, you're to, through a paper consisting of at least 10 to 15 pages from a topic of the student's choosing, that took place between 4 BC and 100 AD, because we're dealing with the New Testament. And you are to explain the cultural concept that exists. Okay? That's what you're supposed to do. You choose to do that however you want to do that. Your weekly assignments and participation is worth 100 points. Your grades on your test is what you get, and the paper is 100 points. And those things are averaged out. We will discuss different things, a lot of different things that we will discuss. Like I said, this is a very good book. I wished I had read it before. Our semester is 18 class periods for 2 hours each week on Thursday night, 6:30 to 8:30. We have a break. And there are other things, and some of you may not have gotten the syllabus, but I'll send it to you because I got your emails today. Any questions? Again, you don't have to have the book if you're just auditing the course. If you don't buy the book, then I'll send you my notes at the end of class. Okay? I got y'all's address and everything. So Steve, you didn't get it twice, did you? I looked over there, my glasses off, and it says 060, but it's 06 at.
Yeah.
So I think one of them came. Okay, one of them came. Okay, so we're going to begin, and like I said, I have a lesson plan, and it's on each of those divisions that's in the book, and so it's not going to be 18 lesson plans. We'll just cover what we can cover, because I just cannot read right out of a book and try to teach a class, and I'm having to do that in archaeology over at Fayetteville, and it just nerve-wracking to me. So, but I do have my notes right here. And also there's something else I got to do. Let me go back here, put it back on full, and there's chat. Any of y'all, Lawrence is online. Okay. All right. So if you're going to use chat, now you better tell me what you want, because I don't pay any attention to chat. Okay. So if you're on a computer and you want to ask a question, you can type it in there, or you can just stop me and then you ask me the question. Okay? I'd rather you ask me the question instead of typing it, but some people don't do it that way. Okay, Tommy is loud, so I got to close the door. He's wound up. He used to be across the hall. And we had to close our doors because both of them get loud.
Yeah.
And usually I stand back here, but because of the books we're going to use, I'm going to stand out here. Okay, let's have a word of prayer and we'll begin. Holy Father, again, we are thankful for the day and for the safe journey to this place. And we ask thy continual blessings to be upon us as we strive all the days of our life to live as thou would have us to live. And we're thankful for the Georgia School of Preaching, for the classes that they have that will help us to grow in the grace and the knowledge of thy word. We ask thy blessing upon the elders of this congregation and the congregation in other places that help support this great work. We're mindful of those who have who are sick. We pray, Father, richest blessings to continue to be upon them, those who've lost loved ones, and those who are less fortunate than we. We ask thy blessings upon the church throughout the world and also upon our country and nations of the world that we may have peace. Forgive us in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. The book starts out asking this question, why this book? Now, again, if you go back and you get Mr. Bell's book, his book is this one I have is 1998. And I think it's first published many years ago, 1945, and so it has been updated. And this is the only one that I could find. You can find them online, and they're pretty reasonable. But his book is an illustrated guide for the world of Jesus and the first Christians. Now, again, all that simply means is that he's gone back and he's done the research and read other things that other people have read. And when I say that, I'm not talking about going back and reading other books of people doing the same thing, which he may have done that also. But he's gone back to the historians of the day so that he has gotten the firsthand knowledge. And there are books that have been written, and more and more of those books have been written. I've had to do some work, research work that I had to do, and I went back and I went down to Amazon, to Barnes Noble down here, and I said, I need some Greek books. And they said, language? And I said, no, history. And they ordered these little bitty paperback books. I was studying the book of Revelation, what I was doing, and I was trying to prove what some people were saying from the writings of the historians of the day. And so they ordered me a bunch of those. And now, like in my Logos program, I have a bunch of those in my Logos program, so I can read those. And that's what this fellow has done, Mr. Bale. And if you get my notes, you're going to see something in there. You'll be reading along. For instance, I'm going to read this. The synagogue, a familiar feature of Jewish life since the Babylonian exile, now became its very foundation. It has in parentheses 2.142. Well, that's the footnote that you have to go back in the back and find. That's the resource that he got that from, and it's just filled with resources. So it is a good book. But now in my notes, I don't give the footnotes. I give the number. I'm not going to fill in with all those footnotes. And so if you want to find those, you can actually get the book. But as the first century dawned, the little homeland of the Jews, as we would say, was better known as the kingdom of Herod the Great. And there's a lot of history. If we were to go back to biblical archaeology and we're studying the Old Testament, it would bring us to that of the intertestament period, and then we'd come in more contact with where Herod and all his family came from if we were to do that type of study. And that study is done, I think, here on Tuesday nights with Brother Burt. But it extended along the Mediterranean coast from a wadi, that's a small river, as we would say, wadi, W-A-D-I, known as the River of Egypt. And if you'll notice sometimes, if you look, it comes down, the mountain does come down, and right down here in this little curve, there's the River of Egypt. And the reason I remember that, because I remember Bible geography. But some 30 miles below Raphia, northwest of Caesarea, a spectacular port city created by Herod, and along its southmost border, Herod's kingdom extended some 70 miles inland to the southern tip of the Dead Sea. We'll talk about the Dead Sea also. Above the Dead Sea, the kingdom reigned over the Jordan River, but nowhere extended more than 80 miles from the coast. Then above Caesarea, the king's land cut sharply, extended sharply away from the coast, and taking in that of the Sea of Galilee and reaching down to the east to incorporate Gentile-occupied territories. And that's very important, because we need to understand that when we read about Jesus, we read about him a lot of time in that of the areas, and there are Gentile people there. And so altogether, the kingdom of Herod stretched around about 80 miles across and only 160 miles from the south to the north. Now, while Herod was a personal friend with the Caesars, now when I say that, you and I know what personal friends mean to us. Well, personal friends didn't mean that to them, but they were personal friends, okay? But if Herod crossed Mr. Caesar or King Caesar, however you want to call him, they didn't mind chopping his head off or getting rid of it in some way. And so, they were arrogant. They were driven a sponsor of spectacular building projects. And when you go through and you look at archaeology, or even you look at pictures in the books, that they have, you can see that. The land he ruled was, in fact, an insignificant and backward district. It was a buffler kingdom that was in effect a part of the Roman Empire, and shortly after that, other agricultural products that were needed by the empire were produced by them. And so the notion that anything really significant might happen there would never have crossed anybody's mind, Nazareth or any of those places, especially the Romans, whose administration and legions ruled the world at the time. They didn't think that anything would ever come of this place where the Jews lived. Now, remember, though, that the Jews back at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, that the Jews had been scattered. Okay, you had the outside Palestine Jews, and then the outside Jerusalem Jews, and then you had the other Jewish people, and there were a difference between them. And we will also mention some of this difference that they had between the Jews that lived in Judea and those that lived throughout Palestine. Now, since the land where Jesus was born was viewed differently by different people. In the first century, about 1/10 of the population of the Roman Empire, 1/10 was Jewish. Only 1/10. Though that was only about 500 to 600,000 Jews lived in their ancient homeland. And so again, we have to remember there was this dispersion, and James and Peter mentions that dispersion. Most major cities of the empire relative had a large Jewish population, and these men and women, they looked to Jerusalem actually for their spiritual and legal guidance, because the temple had been restored after Babylonian captivity, and the high priesthood had been restored, even though it may have been not truly according to the lineage, or by that of being Aaronic, that is from Aaron at times, but all that had been restored, so they would look to Jerusalem and they would come down, because we find in Acts chapter 2, it was time for that of Pentecost, and they came down to Pentecost, and something like anywhere from 1 to 3 million people showed up in Jerusalem. And so it was there that they would look for that of their spiritual guidance. But we would find that pairs of sages, scribes, teachers of the law, all three of those are mentioned in the Gospels. And so they went out from Jerusalem with official word about the dates of the Jewish holidays. And to, Bobby forgot. As I usually do, set the battery. That usually shows up somewhere along the line sometimes. Usually I plug it up and it's always on. But they're the ones that talked about the holy days, and also they were to settle a dispute within that of the Jewish communities by applying the ancient Mosaic code. And so now we're going to talk about the Sadducees. Now you get that, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Herodians, and we're going to talk about the Samaritans and some others, especially the Essenes. Brother Ferguson deals more with the Essenes than anybody I've ever seen. And that might be because a lot of stuff has come to pass in the last few years. But to the empire's Jews, Judea, and especially for Jerusalem, was far from being insignificant, because it was the holy city. And there was the focus of their faith. There was gifts that poured out into the temple treasury from Jews all around the world. And so Jerusalem had a reputation even among that of the pagan people. And we understand that because we can read that of the Old Testament and find out among those people that what they thought about that of Jehovah, God the Father, as we would say. But the Jerusalem temple had been expanded and beautified by Herod the Great. Now, I wonder why he did that. Well, by the end of his 40-year reconstruction project, it ranked as one of the wonders of the ancient world. How beautiful it was. So many wealthy Gentile travelers made a pilgrimage just to Jerusalem for that one purpose, just to see the temple. And it's just like if you stop for a moment and think, I don't know if you've been to Washington, but we have these things now where a lot of places, make up money, and they send the World War II veterans back to Washington to see the World War II monument and all that stuff. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. I've seen it myself. And so that's about the same thing, is that they would go back and they see it. But this had a very spiritual significance to it. But even the Gentiles wanted to see the temple. And even though he or she, the Gentiles, were were unable to go into it, they still wanted to see it. That is, they couldn't go into the inner confines of it. And so the port city of Caesarea also gained worldwide reputation because Herod's engineers had created an artificial harbor using great cut blocks of stone and then built a magnificent city on a barren coastal plain. And so that was another thing. So the city boasted administrative centers, an open-air theater, and the Hippodrome for chariot races, and games so popular among the Romans, and temples dedicated to the traditional Roman deities, which we will also make reference to some of them. There was talk to that of the Jewish citizens of Herod's kingdom, and you'll find out as they talked about that there's other perspectives on what the Jews held to be that of the Holy Land. And you had the priestly elite, the wealthy and the comfortable in these different positions, and they were satisfied with the status quo. So we have the Pharisees, and as we would try to just briefly talk about them and try to say something about them, they were, as we would say, the well-to-do class. And so that would include the Apostle Paul. Concentrated their attention on observing every detail of God's law and look forward to the resurrection of the just, because that's what they believed. And still among the common people of Judea, and especially of Galilee, the history and the future of this little land going forward, the present. In the present, the average person struggled to make a living during this time. Working in the city, they did that. They served on one of the largest estates of the king, maybe, or the wealthy was hired as a laborer, or they were just struggling with his own small plot of land. Taxes were high. The temple took a tenth of everything they made. The landlord and the king far more, and one could not even go to the city with produce to sell without paying additional duties along the road and at the city gate. So everywhere they turned, every which way they turned, they had to pay. So within the city, bakers and glassmakers and metalsmiths and potters and those people who sold perfumes, and they plied their trade and paid their taxes and waited. They waited, looking expectantly for God to act. Because, see, again, we have to, in our mind, realize that the Jewish people, especially those that were poor, that many of them believed that Jesus, the Messiah, was going to come. He's going to set up an earthly kingdom in that of the city of Jerusalem. And when he did so, he would destroy the Roman Empire. No longer would the Romans be over the Jewish people. And so throughout this little land, the Jewish population remained convinced that God had spoken to Abraham in that promise that the whole land would belong to his descendants. And so God had spoken to Moses and confirmed the chosen position of the Jews by giving the law to them to live by. And God had exalted his people during the time of David and making Israel one of the most powerful nations of the Middle East. So you go back and you read all these things about the Old Testament. We even find that God had actually promised that one day a descendant of David would appear to lead the people back to their greatness, and that was Jesus Christ. That's what they thought. So here it is in the day of Herod and his Romans overlords, and there were different people that were there, and so they would cast out the Jewish people. The promised one, the Messiah, would rule not only the promised land, but would dominate all foreign nations as well. This is what their thinking was. And so here's why some of the people, and there were those people, and we don't see a lot about these, so we'll make mention of the zealots. They urged an armed rebellion, the zealots did. And they come up as we read the story of the New Testament world. And we find that the Essenes demanded the religious separation to separate themselves from an impure society. And that's the reason why many people, even today, don't believe that the Essenes ever existed, because these people withdrew. And so the majority of the people simply waited. They lived normal daily lives. They watched their children grow up and educated them in that of the Scripture. And they celebrated weddings and grieved at funerals, and they knew the tragedies and the joys and all of human beings and all things that belong to them. And all the while they waited, expecting sure that God would keep his promise and deliverance would come to these people, and they would think, in perhaps maybe in their time, that's what would happen. So why this book? Well, let us go. I can do better if I pull out my New Testament. Go over to Acts chapter 8. And it's befitting for us, I think, one of the chapters that will help us to maybe see some things. When you begin in Acts chapter 8, begin there in verse 26. And we're familiar with the story that takes place. And there's a lot of things we can talk about. For instance, he says, and the angel of the Lord spake unto Philip. Well, why didn't the angel of the Lord just go ahead and talk to the Ethiopian eunuch? Well, that wasn't the angel of the Lord's responsibility. That wasn't what he was there for. And not on that, but most people will say the angel of the Lord, the angel of Jehovah is Jesus Christ, if you go back in the Old Testament. But remember, Jesus is reigning upon his throne. But he says, and the angel of the Lord spake unto Philip, saying, arise and go toward the south unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem into Gaza, which is desert. And he arose and he went down. He went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority unto Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all his treasure and had come to Jerusalem for to worship, was returning and sitting in his chariot, read Isaiah the prophet. Then the Spirit said unto Philip, go near and join thyself to the chariot. Again, I'd insert, why didn't the Spirit go near? What's the responsibility of the Spirit? Remember, the gospel was put in the hands of men to carry, men, human beings to carry it to the world. So he says, if Philip ran thither to him and heard him read the prophet Isaiah and said, understand thou what thou readest? Now, again, a good question would be, Ethiopian eunuch has the scriptures? Where did he get them? And he said, how can I expect some man, how can I except some man guide me? And he desired Philip that he would come up and sit with him. The place of the scripture which he read was this: he was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb before his shears, so opened he not his mouth. In his humiliation his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. And the eunuch answered Philip and said, I pray thee, of whom speaketh the prophet this? Of himself or some other man? Then Philip opened his mouth and began at the same scripture and preached unto him Jesus. And as they went on their way, they came unto a certain water, and the eunuch said, see, here is water, what doth hinder me to be baptized? And Philip said, if thou believest in thou, with all thy heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He commanded the chariot to stand still. They went down both into the water, both Philip and the eunuch with him. And when they were come up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord called away Philip, that the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. But Philip was found at Azotus, passing through, he preached to all the city till he came to Caesarea. So now, when you look at that, we understand maybe the cultural context of the ancient world is essential for understanding that of the scripture. But this is not an easy task, because of the information on the ancient world is not always clear. Now, Brother Ferguson, in his book, on page 133, he also mentions this in reference to that of the Ethiopian eunuch. And he makes this, he talks about a papyrus. The availability of papyrus and slaves made it possible for books to be produced in the Hellenistic age on a scale previously unknown. Learning, now this is the point that he wanted to make, learning was prized, and there were publishers and booksellers in the major cities to satisfy the desire for reading. Silent reading was virtually unknown. Even in private, one read aloud. Now, what was the eunuch doing? He was reading aloud as he was traveling. That was the way, actually, that they would go about doing those things. And so we would understand, that here he is, he's reading out loud, and we find that Philip joins himself to the church and says, do you understand that? Because Philip heard him also. Now, background commentaries that we read if we teach Bible class, if we preach, we have these commentaries, and they can often help explain a cultural practice or maybe a concept which is important to a particular passage, but even commentaries have limitations on how much information that they actually can provide. So furthermore, reference resources are useful for understanding the viewpoints of the various scholars, while having an in-depth of cultural practices and other ancient literature offers the reader an opportunity to discover things that these practice for themselves first. And we find here, I never thought about him. Why in the world is he speaking out loud? Why was he? I always thought that here he was on a chariot all by himself, but that was my fault. He's by himself. I don't know if he's by himself or not. And that he was just reading again. Where did he get the manuscript? And what was it written? And so we must study the New Testament as objectively as possible to be certain that we understand what it really means to say, and not let cultural baggage or ours get in the way. And sometimes ours get in the way. And so our focus would be the political and the social background against what the New Testament books were, which New Testament books were written. Context, which is fundamental to the fullest possible understanding of all aspects of the Bible, because we talk about text and context. So a crucial part of understanding any written text is knowing something about the historical background of the author and the original audience. And so here we have Philip. And we find that Philip, we were to go back and look at him, where did he come from? Well, go back to Acts chapter 6. Then you come to Acts chapter 8. And then we find here he is, that he joined himself to that of the church, and there he begins to teach him. So to put it in more maybe formal terms, we have to make sure that every text has a context. So the problem rises when someone from another culture or maybe a later time reads that word. Now here's the Ethiopian eunuch. He was separated from the prophet of Isaiah by 700 years. And so to some degree, every word we say is culturally conditioned. Now, he's separated from it. And even our jokes have a context. I went over to Riga, Latvia when the walls broke down in the Soviet Union. And they told me when I got there, and I said, now, Bobby, they won't understand your Southern jokes. I said, they won't. I said, no. But they did understand about Mickey Mouse, Mickey. They understood that. They played some of the same games we played as kids. That was something. But they did not understand some things. We had to be very careful in the way how we spoke, because they did not understand our culture. Well, that was true even in that of the New Testament time. Some phrases from the King James of the Bible, written by people who heard and understood Shakespeare, have meaning for us only because we have heard them explained over many times. Now, sometimes it's not true. Like people talk about the thee and the thou. I have the original King James Bible, a copy of it, in the letter to King James. They wrote it does not have a thee or a thou in it. Okay? So when people say, well, that's Shakespearean language, it doesn't have it in the letter to King James. The thee and the thou make reference to it. They don't do it 100% of the time, but that was their intention. And so we have to remember that these people that was translating it, though. I remember one time, I have this in the notes, and I can't remember if it's in the notes here, the notes for archaeology, I get them mixed up. But like 2 Timothy 2, verse 15, study to show thyself approved. And the fellow just pitches a fit every time a preacher would quote that. He says, the Bible does not tell us to study. I said, well, if he has to read it, if you give forth diligence, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed. But if you were to go back to the 1800s, or the Webster Dictionary, you can go back, you look up that word, and it was the time that it was written, it was like 1250 to 1300 BC. And that word did have a different type meaning. It was to be busy. We had to devote oneself to concentrate on, and on back even to the Latin and so forth. But that's what it meant. So we have to make sure that we understand that when we read the King James Bible or any other Bible, that when we read it, that we understand the background of those people who are translating. You have to remember also that those people who are translating the King James Bible, that if they made a mistake, that they had the death penalty upon them, that they could be put to death. And so they were trying to the very best of their ability, but they had a wicked king also, King James. So we have to make sure we understand that. The meaning of many English words have changed in the 4th centuries, which separate us from all the way back to them. So again, like for instance, Matthew 19:14, King James says, suffer the little children to come unto me. The meaning of the word suffer, allow or let them come, but not to suffer, allow or to let them. And so we should understand that actually the word suffer means to send away, sense to leave alone. And also I mentioned 2 Timothy 2 and verse 15. So we have to make sure, again, that we understand in reference to these words and what they mean. That word study actually means to give diligence. And I don't know, most of the time if I quote that passage, I usually simply say that he says study, that means to give diligence. give forth great labor, study. Uh, when I was in Memphis School of Preaching, I understood that word. You know, so they told us if you drop your pencil or lead breaks in your pencil or your ink pen runs out, you're 2 weeks behind. And I kind of figured that was true. But the modern literal version, which is the one that I use, that's a literal version, be diligent, he says, to present yourself approved to God and an unshamed worker, cutting straight the word of truth. So if it can be that hard to understand the older text written in our own language, how much greater the problem that confronts us when reading books from cultures which use a different language from ours. And so that's what we're doing. We're reading the Bible. The Bible was written in the language of the common people, and we're reading that. But here we are these many years away from that time. In other words, so this is the year 2020. If we just go back and say that's 1,990 years from the day of Pentecost, it's AD 30. And so the Ethiopian eunuch was almost certain using a Greek translation of Isaiah, putting him at an immediate disadvantage. Like him, we have to rely on a translation or spend several years learning the original language of the text. And a person doesn't have to know the Greek language or the Hebrew language or Aramaic language or the Latin language in order to understand the Bible. It's just, of course, like one fellow says, how deep do you want to understand it? Well, it's good to be able to look at words. I remember at Cartersville, we used to have classes on Thursday night when I first moved back home. That's my home. When I moved back, we had classes on Thursday nights. And someone kept talking about knowing the Greek language. I said, well, we'll teach a Greek class. You can imagine, about 30 people showed up. I was shocked. But what we did is show people how to use Strong's Concordance and things like that. So, you look these things up. And they thought that was very interesting for them to do so. So if we stop to think about it, we might wonder how accurate the translation was that the Ethiopian eunuch was using. Because translation is an art, not just a matter of looking up a word in a dictionary and finding its equivalent in another language. Now, the modern literal version has tried to translate, like, let me just use this word, the word baptizo, immerse. Every time you find it in MLV, you'll find the word immerse. And every time you find the word you and it's got a little circle behind it, it means it's plural. That's interesting, too. And so they try to help things in reference to that way. But there are words and idioms have subtle shades of meaning, which is non-native speaker has trouble picking up. I had a lot of trouble when I began to study the Bible about those idioms. But you consider the difference between blowing up a photograph and blowing up a balloon and blowing up a bridge. So how would we translate the intent of those phrases in another language? So we're using that word blowing up. We're going to blow up a balloon, we're going to blow up a photograph, or we're going to blow up a bridge. So all literature contains some type of cultural condition and material. And it's not necessary to understand the culture fully to benefit from the reading of the documents, but having some type of a degree of insight into that of the culture can enrich one's reading significantly and help one guard against erroneous interpretation. We just went through this holiday periods, and Wednesday night before, I taught a class on Wednesday night, and I went to the hospital later. But I taught a class, and I said, most people think Jesus was born in a stable and so forth. Well, you have to understand the housing of Palestine. And what I pointed out to them, I said they had a door. When you open up the door, you turn to the right and you go up, and that goes up to like a little small loft. That's their one-room house, And over here where you just went up, there's like two little holes, and that's kind of slanted down, but the animals go in up under that. And they feed the animals through those little holes. They call them manger. And that's where Jesus was born. He wasn't born out where the cows were. And the reason why there was no room in the inn, because if this house had an extra room on it, it was an inn. We had a house above, a room above it. It was like an inn. That's what they called it. But we have to realize also, Joseph was from that area. Remember, he's from the lineage of David, and they were in Bethlehem, which is the city of David, it's called. And so you stop and do a lot of thinking. And so you have to read all of that culture and read about all in reference to how they dealt with people back then. And remember, they had midwives and so forth. She would need that of a midwife and so on. So we have to make sure we understand that all literature contains some culturally conditional material. So when applied to the New Testament, though, this approach is not intended to undermine anyone's faith. There are those who are devout Christians seem to fear that reading about the New Testament instead of just reading the New Testament will have that effect. It will destroy their faith. That's not true. Now, there are books out there. I mean, I went to the, as I call them, theological cemeteries. Instead of seminaries, I've gone to two of those. And one of them was a cemetery. Let me tell you, I never heard people talk so nasty in my life. They use God's name in vain and so forth in a theological seminary or cemetery. But I understand there are books that do that. But when you're searching for those things that are right, those things that are true, those books are not going to do that. A person, if you were to study someone else in reference to the housing of Palestine, they may come up with a different view, and they do. Because, yes, Jesus could have been born in the stable, but we have to realize the development of that of Bethlehem. And plus, like I said, Joseph was from that area. And so how important, as we think about that, such a view, it seems to imply that the world in which the New Testament writers live is so like ours, or had so little influence on the New Testament writers, that the modern readers' understanding of the text would be unhindered by cultural difference. But, you know, I just wonder if I were to take some teenagers today and sit them all down and say, yeah, we're going to leave. When we leave here, we're going to go by a telephone booth and call. How many of them know what a telephone booth is? You know, they're going to see how many of y'all young people can get into a telephone booth, or to get into a beetle, a bug, you know, stuff like that. Some of them would not. What are you talking about? You know, just like, I don't know about you, but sometimes I think about my past, and I think about, well, why didn't you just call home? First thing I think about is my cell phone. But that was 50 years ago, you know. We didn't have a cell phone. You pulled up at a phone booth and called home with a dime. Well, I think it's a dime we had to pay. So Christians believe that the New Testament contains a message which changes people's lives. So how important is it then to understand as much as possible about the New Testament as we possibly can, so that we can be sure of the validity of our interpretations and communicate the message as fully as possible? That's just like when we get down talking about, they went up to Jerusalem or went down to Jericho. So, well, the atheist comes along, or an agnostic, or an unbeliever, not to be the word of God. They say that's not true. But the Bible doesn't look at things like that the way we do. We look at whether it's a mountain. They look at altitude. You know. And so we have to understand that. So actually, it's happening as scholars come to see the importance of studying the background of a particular text. A man by the name of Molina says, and I quote him, it's from the book, any adequate understanding of the Bible requires some understanding of the social system embodied in the words that make up our sacred scripture. Even Bruce Metzger concurs by saying every serious attempt to understand the scriptures must be historically oriented. Now, they're not trying to say that some people go too far, and I understand that some people go too far in reference to that. But they're not trying to say that. They said, for you to understand it, you've got to understand the culture, the manners, and the customs of the day. And we do. Because we asked the question in the book, they asked this question. He calls it from the ivory tower to the pew. Y'all know what the ivory tower is? To pew. So what about the people in the pews? Where can a Christian serious about the study of the New Testament turn for help? Is it necessary to go to school preaching, or studies are intended for such people to point them to the material which presents scholarly information in a way that the non-professional, quote, readers can understand, or either working on their own or in a special group? Now, here's an illustration. The minister described Paul's imprisonment, okay? During the course of his sermon, the congregation was given a graphic picture of the Apostle Paul clanking around in chains in a dank, foul-smelling dungeon that would have made the Tower of London look like a luxury hotel. And the account was so vivid, they went on to say, that we could practically hear the rats scurrying around the straw on the floor. This preacher was good. He says it was almost totally inaccurate. That's not the way the Romans treated people in prison. It's not that way. This is an isolated incident, but it illustrates the problem. The minister misunderstood understanding of the culture of the New Testament times was actually affecting his interpretation of the text, which was actually the book of Philippians. Now, Philippians chapter 1 and verse 13. Now, Brother Ferguson on page 55, he deals with this thing. He says, the Praetorian Guard, Philippians 1:13, held a higher status and received higher pay than other soldiers. And why was that? It was because of this idea of a bodyguard concept. And so he was reading into it things that not there in an effort to make his point about how God helps us to bear under adversity. But we understand that God does. And yes, Paul was under some adversity, but not that bad. You remember, he had his own house eventually and things of that sort. And if you came there, we'll notice this about prisons. It's according to what type of prisoner you were. Now, remember, he wasn't charged with a crime. He was by the Jewish people, but he hadn't broken any Roman law, but he appealed to that of Caesar, so they had to carry him there. And he wasn't being exiled. He wasn't being as a prisoner as we would think of him being, that he'd done some awful crime. He was waiting to talk to Caesar. And so, at the same time, we find he was missing some of the real meaning of the passage that we find in the book of Philippians there. So because of the high elevation of Jerusalem and the temple, one goes down or comes up from it. That's according to what passage you read. In the notes, I give a number of passages. In the same way, the language of Acts 18 and verse 22, where it says, he went down, that is from Ephesus to Caesarea. Went up, greeted the church, and went down to Antioch, suggests that Paul visited Jerusalem. Jericho was lower in elevation than Jerusalem, hence one would go down there. Robbers were coming along the road and would especially attack the person traveling along, and many people did not have extra clothes, which were very valuable, and so they'd steal the clothes and sell them. But the idea is we have to understand from a cultural standpoint, he's talking about altitude. He's not talking about, anything else. And so I remember first time I heard that, I said, well, that's what it says. Or he went up. And they said, well, but it was up from the reference to altitude. And then also when we think about the theology and that of the history, when we go exploring the cultural backgrounds of the New Testament, it's not the same as studying its theological meaning. The theological meaning is often influenced by the cultural context of the passage. So let us look at some of the specific examples of how understanding social, cultural background of the New Testament enables us to interpret the text. As we said, now we talked about Paul in reference to his being in prison. The phrase writing from prison conjures up in our minds a man in a small cell with no freedom of movement. Now, have you ever talked to a policeman? They said, would you like to go to 8 by 10? Is it 8 by 10 or 6 by 8? Something like that sale. Well, I've seen those. Matter of fact, Monday, because my wife and I had a wreck over in Fayetteville. We rode in the back of a police car. Man, I've never been so cramped in my life. I mean, you didn't have room to move. But you can imagine, you're riding from a prison. Just the idea of riding from a prison. I've been to the jail cells in Bartow County and looked at them and inside there and talked to people that need to be talked to. But Oxford Classical Dictionary, second edition, says, and I quote, Roman criminal law did not recognize the imprisonment of free persons as a form of punishment. Now, the digest part of the first collection of the Roman laws, published in 533 AD and reflected much earlier practices, admits that the that the governors of the provinces sometimes imprison people, but, quote, they should not do so for such penalties as that are forbidden. Prisons are for holding men for trial, not punishing them. So how long as an individual might be detained for a question or until a trial was held could vary. But there was no right of habeas corpus or guarantee to a speedy trial. So family or friends, however, were not likely to be denied access to the prison. And some magistrates did not gain reputations for treating prisoners cruelly. But this was a matter of individual personality, not that of the Roman policy. Now, stop for a moment and think, just as soon as they heard that Paul was a Roman citizen, what did the Roman person want to do? He wanted to do, don't you touch it. They protected it. They did everything they possibly could. And there was a reason behind that, because they don't do that. Not only that, but if they allowed it to take place, then it would mean they would lose their province. So once sentence has been passed, a person might be incarcerated until punishment is inflicted. That usually follows close on the heels of the trial. The severity of the punishment varied according to the guilty person's social status. Fines could be imposed, particularly on wealthier people. Forced labor was a common penalty for the lower class, but they were not necessarily locked up each night. Pliny, historian, discovered several cases of men who had walked away from the mines and quarries to which they had been condemned, and who in their old age, from all reports, are living modestly and quietly. Quietly is the good word. If you go over to Acts chapter 28 and just watch what it says, and again, we read and we give explanations sometimes, and maybe we don't ask the right questions when we read that. We just give the impression that Paul's in prison. And sometimes we'll read passage and we'll say, does anybody have any comment? Nobody will say anything, so we just pass them over. But here in that passage, verses 30 and 31, he says, Paul dwelt 2 whole years, well, notice this, in his own hired house. He wasn't working. I wonder who paid for that. The Romans didn't take it out of the Roman treasury. Who paid for it? It had to be friends. It had to be congregations where Paul, Christian friends, it had to be congregations where Paul had preached. And he says, and received all that came unto him. Remember, now he writes to the Philippian church. That's the point he points out to the Philippian church, and how much that they had helped him while he was in prison. And so he goes on, he says, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching those things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence, no man forbid him. Isn't that amazing? Why is he in there? Because he preached the gospel. Now he's in there, he's in his own hired house, and he's able to do exactly what he was doing before he was arrested and charged. And so he has now changed his abiding place from some temporary abode to a more permanent one. He's in his own hired house. And that is what concerned Luke most. All this time, Paul was a prisoner of the state, and yet the expenses incurred were probably defrayed by that, as we said, friends, not only that, but other places. So Paul, during those days, chained to a soldier. Now, he was chained, and probably in the night, 2 soldiers watched him according to the sentence of Roman law. That back in Acts chapter 27, verse 3 says, and the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh them. And the idea there was he would be loosed from that of his chains so he could go. And so I like this book again. Like I said, it's a good book. It's on page 50. They just open right up. Since we have somebody in class, we'll show them. Here's a picture of a centurion. Y'all see it? Y'all see it, right? Y'all see it? Jumping Jim, you see him? All right. So that's a centurion. There are other pictures also in there. But when we study, and like with myself, and I study, and I think about, sometimes people say, Bobby, you ask too many questions to yourself about things. But we do not know why Paul's trial was delayed. Now, his appeal would have to wait its turn. I understand all that. But when his case came up for trial, the records of it from Festus may have been lost in the shipwreck, you remember. Now, I can understand that. And maybe an order for an official copy would have to be sent all the way back to Caesarea, and a hearing postponed until the copy of the records would arrive. All that had to take place. Paul's case would lose its place in the court's calendar, there would be a longer delay in reaching it again. So Paul frequently references in his prison epistles that the prisoner confirms maybe that view, because he talks about them in the book of Ephesians, the book of Philippians, and the book of Colossians, and also in the book of Philemon, which of all 4 books was written while he was in prison. So he had great privileges as a prisoner. His friends could visit him and receive instructions from him. He had opportunity to write these letters to the different congregations. So he was not hindered in his work. Matter of fact, it seems, and I hear a lot of people, and I conclude myself, that he did a great work, because he wrote these letters, and we have those letters today to help guide us. Now, that doesn't say he had never been arrested. He would never have written them, because he was, again, guided by the Holy Spirit to write what he wrote. He was allowed complete freedom of speech. People come and go. He used his liberty to speak out boldly to all who came to him to hear the gospel. He tells us of himself that other Christians who saw a bound prisoner speak so free were encouraged by his example, Philippians 1:12 and 14, to speak out. It's interesting also in Romans 16, verses 3 through 15, that Paul's companions and visitors during his imprisonment contains a list of salutations to that of Christians in Rome. And this was written probably 13 years before Paul ever got there. So Paul had already heard about people that were in Rome. If we look at the book, and the Romans there in chapter 16, beginning in verse 3, and we read what it says, most of the time we read again, we don't ask questions about, why are these people greeting the Apostle Paul? Or why is Paul greeting them? Why does he say he knows these people or met these people? It's because he heard of them. And so he mentions in his epistles companions like Timothy, Epaphras, Onesimus, Tychicus, Aristarchus, Mark, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, Justus, who was called Jesus, also Jesus, Luke, the author of Luke, was also with him and when he wrote the book of Acts chapter 16, where he joins himself. And also he talks about, and this is very important to me, Philippians 4 and verse 22, he talks about some members of Caesar's household that obeyed the gospel, basically. And so when you look at that, Roman sources reveal more generally how prisoners were treated during Paul's lifetime. Now, you stop and you think about it, see, in our mind, what kind of picture have we given ourselves? What kind of picture have we given over to people? Here's Paul in a prison. What was going on in that prison? Well, when you put all that together, Paul was preaching and teaching the gospel. People were coming and going as he was preaching the gospel. People were obeying the gospel. They were being baptized into Christ. They were going back to their places of abode, and there they were preaching and teaching the gospel too. And so there are other types of exile. The person was confined as regulated to a particular spot. Persons in exile would live in a house in some small town where they could be watched. And the first person you think of is who? The Apostle John, exiled to Patmos. We'll stop there. We can take a break, and we'll come back, and we'll start with Brother Paul there. Some of our people. Did I talk too fast for you?
You do talk fast.
I tell you what, man, y'all remember that tell me to start this thing back. So those people who missed won't be able to. Okay, because he had.
No, oh, there.
Yeah.
Now you see recording. All
Yep.
right, we be recording again. All right, who did we lose? It's here. Okay. Okay, we were talking about the exile. And like I said, the one that we think about when we think about the exile is that of the Apostle John in Revelation 1 and verse 9. And basically, this type of being put in prison or being jailed or however you want to look at it, it was exile was punishment according to the Roman law, reserved for persons of some status, a fact that which should get light on our reading the book of Revelation. John was not, it seems, some petty criminal in the eyes of the Roman government. Lower class criminals would be sent to work in mines or various places, but you have to realize that if the book of Revelation was written in AD 96, that John was pretty close to 100 years old. If it was written in 68, and I take the early date, then he was in his 60s, and so he could work in the mines. But he was exiled, and so does the Bible say that John was exiled or banished? And so that was a question that comes up. But Patmos is a rocky, desolate land, 10 miles long, 5 miles wide, 24 miles from Asia Minor's coast and 70 miles southwest of Ephesus. Okay? Now, it's not important, I guess, to know exactly where that place is, but again, a question comes up. Why was he sent to Patmos? And he was sent there as a political prisoner. And basically, the same thing that would apply to him would apply to that of the Apostle Paul. And so one needs to remember that Paul was a Roman citizen, though. And John was not a Roman citizen. So actually, John tells us why in the book of Revelation, if we were to go and read, and I'm not going to read all these passages in the book of Revelation, but just to see what they would do in reference to that of their prisons and so forth. This was their customs. It says here And we'll find this in chapter 6, verse 9, chapter 12, verse 11 and 17, chapter 19, verse 10, and chapter 20, verse 4. You find this same phraseology here. He says, and when he had opened up the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain from the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And therefore, for the testimony which they held, in other words, they were preaching and teaching the gospel, and therefore they looked upon them as a political prisoner. And so it would seem there that here in chapter 1 and verse 9, the testimony was being received. And chapter 6 and verse 9, those other passages, it was being upheld. So it seems that John, while on the Isle of Patmos, was to receive that of the revelation. Now, another thing that comes up in our studies that has actually divided the church. And I was telling someone earlier, we were talking, and I think that it's interesting that in Luke chapter 22, and I'm not going to go over there right now, but we will go over there. I'm going to turn this book over here, Brother Ferguson. He wrote some things. Let me see here. I'll put that right there because I'm able to come back and read that. But when we talk about the Last Supper, sometimes all it takes, for one to think about the Last Supper. When y'all think about the Last Supper, see, we have two students in class. And when y'all think about, those of you on the screen on the Zoom here, when you think about the Lord's Supper and you picture the Lord's Supper in your mind, what do you see? The original Lord's Supper, institution of it. Don't you see Jesus there doing the Lord's Supper and the men sitting, right? Well, that's our conception of it. Now, why do we believe that? Because that's the painting, right? We've all seen the painting. In other words, we've seen the pictures of Jesus, right? Long hair, beard, and all that. I don't know if he had long hair, beard. I don't know. But few of us cannot really visualize the event without thinking about Leonardo da Vinci's painting, which was completed in 1498. And even some churches, even states living, take people with people, they reenact this whole thing with the apostles and that of Jesus. And because of the pervasiveness of the influence of this portrayal, it has become part of our unspoken assumption that the Lord's Supper, that everyone present was sitting around a table. Now, most English translations of the Bible use the word sitting, okay, in the passage, then reinforces the image from another side as Mark 14, verse 18, King James says sat. The modern literal version says recline at table. They are reclining and eating. So what do we make of all of that? The passage which says that one of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him, John 13, verse 23. Close to the breast of Jesus, Revised Standard Version says, or reclining on Jesus' bosom, the modern literal version says. So, you get the picture. Kind of confusing how you look at that. But the resolution of the question, though slightly different, is culturally based. Jesus, and his disciples, ate the Passover. And when they ate the Passover, they were not sitting in chairs around a table, but they were reclining on couches. And the Greek verbs used in all the Gospels mean to recline, not to sit. And the phrase to lean or recline on someone's breast is an idiom in Greek, meaning no more than to sit next to someone in English. So we find that even a quick insight into the cultural setting of the narrative resolves what actually appears to be a difficulty of interpretation. No, they were reclining. Now that brings up something else. I don't know. How long y'all been here? Yeah. Okay. Where'd y'all come from? Okay. How long y'all at Woodstock? Where'd y'all come from there?
Pittsburgh.
Oh, Pittsburgh, Florida, Russia. The reason why I asked, there was a man by the name of Brother Macy, brother and sister Macy, we told a Bible camp, and I was up there, and he was a lot older than I was, but I was the one in charge of the cabin. He was my assistant, plus he and his wife worked in the kitchen. And so she stayed up there with the women, and he came to our cabin and was my assistant. Very great man, very humble, wrote songs, and he wrote a sermon outline book. And in his sermon outline book, when I got it, I said, "Are you him?" He said, "Yeah." Well, he used to be a one-cupper. Okay. And so he had this article written about him in the Gospel Advocate. And in my book, I've got the article and everything proposed. But, he says in his study how he came out of that he was reading, studying about it. He come to realize that there had to be anywhere from 4 to 16 cups on the table. So how did that happen? So we asked the question, how many cups? Well, it's the Passover table. And on the Passover table, you've probably heard this, but probably not in the way that we're going to put it. The 4 cups of wine. There is no mention of wine in connection with the Passover in the Pentateuch, but in the Mishnah, strictly enjoins that there should never be less than 4 cups of it provided at the Paschal meal, even of the poorest Israelite. The wine was usually red, and it was mixed with water as it was drunk. The cups were handed around in succession at specified intervals in the meal. 2 of them appear to be distinctly mentioned in Luke 22:17 and 20, called the cup of blessing. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 16 was probably the latter one. That would be the 3rd cup, it would seem. And generally considered to have in the 3rd of the series, after which a grace was said. And there's a comparison like that in Luke 22 and verse 20, where it is called the cup after supper. And so the designation, the cup of Halia, might rather suggest that it was the 4th and last cup. And it is inclined to doubt whether there's any reference in either the passage of the New Testament to the formal ordering of the cups of the Passover, and proves that the same name, cup of blessing, was applied in a general way to any cup of blessing, was applied in general way of any cup which was drunk with thanksgiving, and that the expression was often metaphorically. Now, we say all that because when dealing with examples such as the establishment of that of the Lord's Supper, it is important to determine which parts of the example are meant to follow and which are merely incidental to the situation in which the example occurred. For instance, go to Luke 22 and verse 17. And again, maybe sometimes when we read passages, we read them and we don't maybe ask the right questions, or maybe we just don't see it, and because we're not looking for cultural things. We're just looking at what it said. But look down there at Luke 22 and verse 17, and we're going to connect verse 18 now also to that. Yes, and he took the cup and gave thanks. And he took the cup, singular, okay, and gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves." Now, what does that mean? Divided among you. The word "take" there, if you notice, it says the cup there is singular. It's no definite article in the Greek text. It's a cup, not the cup. Now, the one-cupper people will tell you it's the cup, but it's not the cup. It doesn't have the definite article. It's a cup. And so, really, it's cup, because we don't have no indefinite article in the Greek. But the word "take" there is an imperative, means it's a command. And he says this, which is you, plural, take this, singular. All of you take this, singular, this cup, singular, this cup, singular. Divide, it's a second person plural, finite verb, among yourselves, he says. You divide among yourselves, plural. You, plural, divide among yourselves, plural. Now, a single cup was blessed, right? But it distributed by divided among the disciples. And some would argue, well, this was done prior to the Lord's Supper, and it was. And so, and they'll say that's what it was, and it's not how the actual supper was done. Well, the flaw in that reasoning is given in verse 18. What does he say? He says, and he took he says, "For I say unto you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine." Now, what did they just divide? The fruit of the vine. He says, "Until I drink it with you, until the kingdom of God shall come," he said. And so this is a reference to the Lord's Supper, as Matthew and Mark account clearly shows. And it could not be a reference to the Passover, as some people try to say, is that memorial meal had ended with the Old Testament law and is not a part of the kingdom in the New Covenant. Therefore, Luke's account gives us additional detail that Matthew and Mark account skips over. And Jesus first divided the context of the cup, and then he instituted the Lord's Supper. And that's what he did. And again, we understand that he's not really talking about basically the cup, it's the contents of the cup. But this points out to us that, yes, there were 4 cups there for the Passover, but he says, divide among you, it's 12 apostles. So Brother Macy is right. It's anywhere from 4 to 16 cups sitting on the table. Now, the word likewise, he says there to us in verse 20, likewise also the cup after supper, he says. Likewise is an adverb which shows the manner in which a verbal action occurs. And so like manner or likewise, it's the marker of similarity that approximates identity. So the word likewise indicates that the same method was used for the cup as done for the bread. So even if you argue that verse 17 was separate from the Lord's Supper, it still established the method in which the cup was distributed. It was divided and given to the disciples just like the bread, likewise. Therefore, Luke gives us an account in reference to the multiple cups. I don't know if y'all have ever visited, anybody ever visited one cup congregation? I have. I didn't go when they was having communion. I went to hear in a meeting, and the fellow wanted to start an argument, and I just listened. You know, I wasn't there to argue with him. He wanted to talk about women and their work in the church and stuff like that. And we had a fellow who the congregation where I was preaching at that time, I was preaching, the congregation came out of the denominational world, evolved into the church. And one of their members got upset, so he went to the one cup church one time, and he's going there. And so I was emphasizing when I got there, you got to do what the Bible says. You got to do what the book, chapter, and verse. Thus saith the Lord. And I guess after about 6 months of hearing me say that, he said, well, we don't really do what the Bible says. I said, well, Brother Farmer, what do you mean? He says, well, the Bible talks about the cup. He says, we have more than one cup. I said, well, now, Brother Farmer, and, you know, just thought in my mind. I said, now, Brother Farmer, I don't know about you. I said, but when I take the Lord's Supper, when I drink the cup, I only use one. And I just stopped. I said, how many you use? And he didn't want to answer it. But I only use one cup. And so he hushed. I didn't hear him. He didn't say anything else about that. But the point being here is that the use of the word cup is a figure of speech known as a metonymy. Most people don't know what hermeneutical studies are. We have a girl, a woman, a sister older than I am, obeyed the gospel before I did because she came from Spain. From her husband was a member of the church, and she obeyed the gospel. And so a lot of things, you know, I was going to teach on hermeneutics. She says, what in the world are hermeneutics? She didn't know what they was. And tried to explain to her in our language what a metonymy was, or even anything else, a parable or anything like that. It's hard for her to understand. But this is a metonymy. It's where one noun is used in place of another, to which the two nouns are in close association. There, when we put the kettle on to boil, we're not boiling the kettle, but the water within that of the kettle. When we give the baby a bottle to drink, the baby is consuming the milk in the bottle, and the bottle, not the bottle itself. So Matthew and Mark's account tells us that the fruit of the vine represents the shed blood of Christ for the new covenant. He hadn't shed his blood yet. Remember that. Jesus says, this is my blood. He hadn't shed his blood yet. We realize that in Luke's account that Jesus' statement, this cup is a new covenant in my blood, is a metonymy. The container is not representing Christ's blood, but the contents of the cup. And so the argument is made by noting that Acts 2:41, 3,000 souls were baptized and added to the church. These 3,000 souls participated in taking the Lord's Supper, Acts 2 and verse 42. And it emphasizes that they did all things together, Acts 2 and verse 44. So this leads to one question. If they used but one cup, how big would it have to be for 3,000 worshiping people together to drink from one cup? Now, I asked a fellow one time, as we were talking about this subject, just the side thing, I asked him, I said, now, if you were serving the Lord's Supper, and we've already taken of the bread, and you're passing the cup around, the one cup, and someone, and I've saved 30 people, 15 of us has already partaken of it, and we carry it, and we pick it up, and we carry it, and we hand it to this person, and they drop the cup. I said, what are you going to do? Because, see, they want to say it's the same cup. That, if they say, well, we'll go fill it back up with some grape juice, that's not the same cup. They're drinking from a different cup now because it's got different juice in it, you know. That's why, yeah. And he says, he basically wouldn't answer him. Finally wouldn't answer. He says, I don't know. What would he do? And so the idea is he's talking about what's in there, the contents of it, not the cup itself. The practical application is that multiple containers were most likely used when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. Jesus was not speaking about the physical container or vessel, but the contents and what it represents. The cup is a metonymy. Jesus showed what he meant by cup. He says in Matthew 26:26, he says, "This cup is my blood of the New Testament. I will not drink henceforth from this fruit of the vine until." Then also Mark's account, "This cup is my blood of the New Testament. I will drink no more of the fruit of the vine until." This cup is the New Testament, my blood, Luke 22. The cup, it is not the communion, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ, 1 Corinthians 10:16. Then 1 Corinthians 11:25. This cup is the New Testament, my blood. Take this cup and divide it among yourselves. So it's very easy. But we have to understand, what was the custom? Well, here they were. They were around the table of the Passover. There were 4 cups. And when he tells them to divide it among themselves, that meant they had a cup. And so there was 4 to 16 cups. So he meant the content. The content would be divided would be that of dividing, pouring it into separate vessels, and a party tea is brought into a jug, and the guest says, "Divide it among yourself." Can't we divide it however we see fit when that's the case? Of course we can. So the same autonomy applies to the cup. Any questions? Did I explain that to y'all understand? Okay. Okay, then we think about the images of the crucifixion. I always thought it was interesting because I always was taught, because again, I saw the picture. And most of us up in Georgia, Cartersville Park, we lived out in the country and so forth. And most people had a picture of Christ. And some people had the cross, and some people had Bibles with pictures of Christ. He's on the cross. And so my idea was that Christ's nails went through the palm of his hand, both palms, and then at the top of his foot, this is his foot, he went to the top of his foot right there. Here's the toes, you would say, right in there. And he was nailed, his 2 feet were nailed together. Well, when you begin to think about that, and it's a lot of confusion about it because it talks about the crucifixion, but the artists have left us with really inaccurate impressions on important facets of how Jesus was crucified. And so when we read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that nails were driven into Jesus' hands, we visualize marks in the palms of his hands, because that's what we saw. And you ask the question, well, how did they crucify Jesus? How did they nail him to the cross? They say, they nailed his hands and his feet. But the Bible says hands. But from an archaeological finds, they're studying biblical archaeology here on Tuesday, and I'm doing it on Monday at Fayetteville. But we know that the Roman drove nails behind the wrists because the fragile bones of the hand would not support the weight of the body. And you remember that here he's hanging on the cross. And so the Greek word for hand actually covers the wrist. And the Latin word means the Latin word manus does not. So few artists' representation of the crucifixion was created before that of 100 BC. So the Roman government outlawed that form of execution around 400 BC. And so when the artists read their Latin New Testament, or more likely heard it or read it, they began painting pictures of the crucifixion, and no one was living that had ever seen anyone crucified, so they painted what they thought was the right thing to do, that they got from the text in the hand. But from our archaeological finds, we now know how that the hands would have been fashioned, and that the body would have been positioned on the cross with the legs drawn up and turned to one side, that a single nail could have been driven through both heels, and he was nailed to the cross that way. So in light of the fact that these artists did not know where the Romans drove in the nails during the crucifixion, they're known as the Shroud of Turin. Most of you probably heard of that, which is alleged to be Jesus' burial shroud, presents an interpretive problem, did. And okay. I was hoping it wouldn't rain. But this piece of linen was a faint image of a man on it, has been the center of really a lot of study, controversy late 19th century. But no one has yet been able to explain to everyone's satisfaction how the image was put on the cloth. And so the shroud itself was subjected to carbon-14 testing, which established the date of the cloth around 1300. So some scholars have expressed doubts about the claims of reliability of the date and reservation about the way the tests were done. In the book, there is a drawing based on the remains of a crucified man of the first century in this book, Exploring the New Testament. And he was found in a cave in Jerusalem, and both feet were pierced with one spike just below the heel. And so that's the way they say that people were crucified at the time. And so it's not the way that we say, because again, you got to remember, he's going to be hanging there, and if you put him in the palms, he's not going to be able, he can tear it apart, he can fall. He's going to be hanging there, and not on that, but remember again, they say that he would push up on his feet, what I always heard. Right above the toes there where, it shows, there's nothing there to hold that. Eventually he'd tear it out. When I was a kid, I had a nail go all the way through that same area, all the way through the top of my foot. It was sticking at the top of my foot. And my brothers, one guy on one side of the plank, one guy on the other side of the plank, and they picked me up off from it. And, I had a nail went all the way through. So we need to understand that and try to explain to people when they see that, because again, they have this view when they talk about the crucifixion of Christ in his hands and his feet. So whereabouts in his hands and his feet? Some fellow said the other night when we were talking about this, he says that again, that some of the different people, to them, sometimes the word hand in their writings meant from here to the wrist. And one other fellow says, well, sometimes they meant from the wrist, from the end of the fingers all the way to the elbow, and another fellow, he wanted to go further up to the shoulder. And finally, one of the ladies there says, well, no, y'all just going too far. But, I don't know. I haven't read that. That may be true. But I do understand that the Greek word does mean all the way up to the wrist. Okay, let me ask you a question. You ready? Jesus told us how long he was going to be in the grave. How long was that?
3 days.
3 days. Okay, 3 times 24 is 72, right?
Mm-hmm.
Y'all got that? We got it, right? 72. When did he die?
Friday night.
Friday.
What time?
3
o'clock. All right, if he died at 3 o'clock, and he had to be buried before when? 6 o'clock, right? Because of Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're going to assume it took him an hour to bury. Okay? So 4 o'clock. Now, if he's going to stay in the grave 3 days, 24 hours a day, 72 hours, that'd be Friday to Saturday, Saturday to Sunday, Sunday to Monday. So we can back it up and say, okay, it's Thursday to Friday, Friday to Saturday, and Saturday to Sunday. But it'd be Sunday what? 4 o'clock. You get me? How are you going to get it to be the first day of the week and he rose early in the morning with 72 hours? You can't do it. So there is this problem, and I listened to a fellow, and he said he could pre-prove it, and I listened to him. He didn't prove anything. And he got through it, and everybody in the congregation said, yes, he did. And I said, no, he didn't. I said, if Jesus was crucified at 3 o'clock, buried at 4 o'clock, on whatever day he wants to take, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, doesn't matter to me, then Jesus had to be raised from the dead 72 hours later. That would be 4 o'clock. And he said, well, I explained it. I said, no, you didn't. I said, you said that it's 24 hours per day. Well, the point being is sometimes people have based important parts of their theology on a misunderstanding of the cultural background of the New Testament. Now, Herbert W. Armstrong, the founder of the Worldwide Church of God and ambassador of college and the publisher of the Plain Truth magazine, he argued that Jesus could not have been crucified on Friday and resurrected on Sunday because 3 days won't fit between Friday and Sunday. So any grade school child could see that his arithmetic makes sense. I mean, I can see it's 3 times 24 is 72. So given the way we count, from Friday afternoon to Sunday morning is a day and a half, right? At the most, the way we count. Okay? So, but if if not, if you count like the Jews and the Romans did, they lacked a zero in their mathematical system. The zero was not used as a numeral until the early 7th century BC by an Indian mathematician named, oh man, here's his, well, whatever his name was. His name was Brahma Upta. And without a zero, the Jews and Romans counted the day on which something occurred as the first day. Now watch this. Look over Luke 13:32. It says, and he said unto them, I love this passage, go you and tell that fox, just incidental, that word fox that Jesus uses, he puts it in feminine gender. Go tell that fox. And he applies it to Herod. Can you imagine? He says, behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Today, tomorrow, and the third day. Now, you look at that, you find that Jesus counts in exactly this fashion. Behold, I cast out devils, I do cures today. There's a distinct from yesterday or tomorrow, and tomorrow, this is the next day, and the third day, he says, I shall be perfected. So, further, a portion of a day was counted as a whole day. Notice there, he says, I do it today and tomorrow, and then the third day. Well, he's already in that one day. Now, the next day, tomorrow might be a 24-hour day, and the third day could be 24 days, but he counted all three of them as a day. Well, so if Jesus spent any part of a day in the tomb, it would count as a full day. It's like what I try to get across in my mind is that, a person says, well, in reference to that, says, my mother died, say, using a Jewish time. My mother died Friday at 5 o'clock. Then you'd ask her on Sunday, so how long, when's your mama died? They would say 3 days. Sunday, Saturday, Friday. It's been 3 days. She died 3 days ago. That's the way they would, but we wouldn't do that. Well, how long's your mother been dead? About 2 days. That's what we would say. But again, it's cultural that we have to understand. And so a portion of a day was counted as a whole day. So if Jesus spent any part of the day in the tomb, it'd be a first day. He was placed in the tomb before sunset on Friday. That'd be 6 o'clock. And the day began at sunset. Thus, by counting the system in the New Testament times, Friday was the first day, Saturday was the second day, and Sunday, which began at sundown on Saturday, was the third. No matter how small a part of each day he spent, that was the third day. And remember, it was early in the morning, too. So if we're talking about a 24-hour day, it would mean that Jesus rose 70 days after he was placed in the tomb, before sunset on Friday, to be on sunset on Saturday, to be sunset on Sunday, to be before sunset on Monday equals 42 hours. 72 hours. You'd have to work all of that out for that sole purpose. To see, to know that what's taking place in reference to the way they counted time and the way we count time. And it's hard. It's just like, I know of a couple. They attended the church of Carsville, and their son and his wife and 2 children come every once in a while. No, one child. They come every once in a while, but he says that the Jewish time has never ended. But you ask the question, the Jewish time was from evening to morning. Roman time wasn't from evening to morning. It was from 12 o'clock to 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock at night to 12 o'clock at night, the next night. And so he says, and so they quit coming and started worshiping at home, and they take the Lord's Supper right after 6 o'clock on Saturday night. So we want to take it close as we can to when Jesus died. I said, well, where do you find that in the Bible? It says it on the first day of the week. He says, well, that's the Jewish first day of the week. And I said, we're not talking about the Jewish first day of the week. I said, if you go, if you want to really do the study, I said, go to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2 answers that. He swallowed this fellow who, he and I had conversations, and he finally admitted that he was wrong on some things, but he never would admit that he was wrong on reference to that. But if you read Acts chapter 2, what time was it in the morning? It's 9 o'clock, right? He preached the gospel. 3,000 people obeyed the gospel. When they got to obeying the gospel, what did they do? They took the Lord's Supper. Then I asked you about the one cup. It wasn't one big cup. But they took the Lord's Supper. So it's 9 o'clock in the morning on the first day of the week, and how long would it take for the sermon to be preached and for them to baptize 3,000 people before they worship, take the Lord's Supper? It had to be, according to him, it had to be before 6 o'clock at night, because 6 o'clock at night, that was Monday. I mean, that was the second day of the week. Any questions? I got through faster than I thought I would. I have gone lesson number 2, man. Okay, there are examples over and over in reference to stuff like that, and we'll look at some more of those. But again, it makes us stop and think in reference to that of the culture of the day, what their culture was, what they did. And we have to look at those passages. You know, it's like sometimes people will come along and say, well, you know, we are to take the Lord's Supper like they did at Troas in Acts chapter 20 and have an upper room. Well, I don't have a problem going up to the upper room and having the Lord's Supper. But, you know, I don't know if that was their custom or that's just where they were. But there are examples of only a few passages in the New Testament which have been misunderstood or misinterpreted because of inadequate knowledge of that of the Greco-Roman world in which the New Testament was written. And they illustrate the point. And you have to appreciate people like Brother Ferguson and these other fellows who have written, because when you go back and you look at the things that they have written, they have done a lot of research to come up. Because especially Mr. Bale, because he goes back and reads the ancient historians and what they did. And so they illustrate the point that understanding that cultural background of the New Testament can have an impact on one's theological understanding of what the passage is saying. And so at the risk of being repetitious and understanding the context affects our interpretation of the text. And so what we're going to do in our study is to introduce the information that we have to help us to go always to the context of the life of Jesus and the life, which is Judaism. We have to understand Judaism. I taught a course at Carsville on Thursday night, 2-hour course, and it was on Judaism. And one of the members of the church, her father was a gospel preacher, and he had passed away. And she told me, she said, "You like to converted me to Judaism." She was just kidding. But she got so into that about reading and studying. But we have to realize that in the context of the life of Jesus, what was going on was Judaism. Now, we understand that Christianity began in when Jesus, after Jesus died. But during the life that Jesus lived upon the earth, if we say 30 years, that he was upon the earth before he was crucified, during that time, he lived under Judaism. And we find that, because we're going to talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and some other seeds, some of them. And we're going to see what Jesus does. He doesn't always condemn the Pharisees, but he does condemn them. But there are some things that he says that they were right in. So since we think about all of that, we have to take that context of Judaism. We will begin by looking at various facets of that religion and culture, then examine the political structure of the Roman Empire before studying certain aspects of the Roman culture in more detail, because we have to know something about that of Judaism. Now, it's hard for some people, and I gather this, what was the name of the movie, Gibson?
No, The Passion of Christ.
Or
The Passion.
The Passion of Christ. Now, you remember when that came out, what did the Jewish people say?
They were angry, basically.
They were angry, very angry, because the movie depicted that they were the ones that crucified Jesus Christ. They weren't. All you have to do is read Acts 2. That's what, wasn't that what Peter said? You crucified the Christ?
The Bible says Pilate told them, "It is your responsibility." Pilate told them, if you want to do it, you do it.
He said, "I'm free from the blood." So, but the thing of it is, when you talk about, we understand that they get upset, but then some people, when you talk about Jesus being a Jew, Matthew and Luke both included genealogies at the beginning of their Gospels to lay claim to Jesus' Judaism in no uncertain terms. He was a Jew. He was from the tribe of Judah. Very plainly taught, and it has to be because of Genesis 49 and verse 10, it has to fulfill the prophecy there that that's what was going to take place. The scepter would not leave until the Messiah would come. In Genesis 49 and verse 10, that was the prophecy. And the Gospels were written at a time when the Christians were trying to establish an identity of themselves. Notice now, Matthew was written, basically, we've come to this conclusion in our studies of Introduction to the New Testament, that Matthew was written basically to that of the Jewish people. Mark was written basically to the Roman people. Luke was written to the Gentile people, and John was written to prove that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, basically, because of Gnosticism and things of that sort. But the point being, they were written when the Christians were trying to establish identity for themselves, separate and apart from that of the Jews. And so who had staged a long and bloody revolt against Rome ever since 66 to 73 BC. And so Jews, in turn, wanted to know part of the heretics who recognized an executed criminal as the Messiah. And that's why they looked upon Jesus. He was a criminal. And so among the 18 benedictions regularly recited in the synagogues was one which asked God to let the Nazarenes and the heretics perish as in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living. Is one of their benedictions. So the Gospel of John, many scholars feel reflects a decidedly negative view of the Jews and typical of Christians by the end of the first century. The early Gospels, especially Matthew, depicts Jesus as sympathetic to Judaism, if not also to its leaders. Now I want to go to Brother Ferguson. I didn't go to him a while ago, and I didn't have to, but let's see here. In his book, he talks about the synagogues. And it was interesting. He says most synagogues had a platform where there would have been a reading stand. Other figures were benches lining the walls in the chief seat, Moses' seat, Matthew 23:2, for the purpose presided. Many had guest rooms adjoining the assembly room. And he gives, they have evidence there in reference to that of pictures about that of the synagogue and how that they would use. And we'll talk more about the synagogue. Let me see here. Another place that he talks about the Pharisees. He says, in reference to them about Jesus, says he had many friendly contacts with certain Pharisees. He gives a list of those passages. He says these verses, if nothing else, should have made unnecessary the lesson many Christians have had to learn from the Jewish scholars that Pharisees were synonymous with hypocrite. He goes on to face and says that's not the case. Yeah, they were called hypocrites, but just because they were a Pharisee doesn't mean they was hypocrites. You look at the Apostle Paul, was he a hypocrite? He basically knew the law better than anything else, but yet they had their traditions, and instead of, they would say, well, this is what you got to do. That would be according to their tradition, but what did the old law say that they were supposed to do? And then that's what Jesus says. He says, you do as the Pharisees say, not as they do. In other words, because what they were saying was true, but what they were doing was completely contrary to what it was. And so that's what he tries to get across. And so to more understand more adequately what Jesus saw as his mission and why the early Christians eventually separated themselves from the Jews, we need to actually survey how the state of Judaism was in that of the first century. I always thought it was interesting that when you turn over to Acts chapter 6, and here's the church, and we'll talk more about the dispersion and so forth, but here it wasn't. The church is doing very well. People are obeying the gospel, and they're growing like everything in the city of Jerusalem, and the gospel has gone through Judea, but it hasn't left Jerusalem and Judea. And they're going to do that in Acts chapter 8. But here in chapter 6, it says, and in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecian against the Hebrews. Now, the Grecian are who? People that live outside of Jerusalem in Judea. He says, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Now, when we study about them, we're going to understand more why they did that. They looked upon themselves as a different class of people. They looked upon the Grecians as a different class of people. And the Grecians looked upon the Hebrews of Judea and everything as a different class also. It was both ways. He says, then the 12 called the multitude of disciples unto them and said, is it not reason that we should have the word of God and leave the word of God and serve tables? Wherefore, brethren, look ye amount of you 7 men of honest report, full of the Holy Ghost, wisdom, whom ye may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and the ministry of the word. Now, they weren't trying to pass on a responsibility. Or they were going to neglect their responsibility to take on this other. They said, look, we know what we're supposed to be doing, so this is what you do. They're giving them inspired information. And he says there, and so he said, and the saying pleased the whole multitude, and they chose, watch this now, Stephen, a man full of faith and Holy Ghost, and Philip, and Prochorus, and Nicanor, and Timon, and Parmenas, and Nicholas, the proselyte of Antioch, whom they set before the apostles, and when they had prayed and laid hands on them, and the word of God increased, and the number of the disciples multiplied in Jerusalem, a great multitude of priests were obedient to the faith. Now, we're going to look at their names. Okay? Because who was being elected? Neglected. The Grecians. Guess who most of these people are that were elected? Yes. Grecian Jews. And the thing of it is there was something that had to be done because here these Jews were divided among themselves and had been so. And so it was once fashionable to talk about the distinction between the Jews of the Palestine and those of the dispersion. Or diaspora, I think is what they call it. That is the Jews scattered across the Mediterranean world. James talks about it in James 1 and verse 1, and also in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. Watch this. Let's read James 1 in verse 1. He says, James, a servant of God and of Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad greeting. Now, do we understand that, right? The 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. Now watch watch over in Peter. 1 Peter 1:1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, and the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Now let's go back to Acts chapter 2. Go down to verse 8. Luke records it. How hear we every man, he recorded the Jewish people talking. And how hear we every man in their own tongue wherein we are born? Watch it now. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, dwellers of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, and Egypt, parts of Liberia, Cyrene, strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes, and Arabians. We do hear them speak in all tongues the wonderful works of God. Now, where were those people from? They were dispersed. And they were there on the day of Pentecost, and when they obeyed the gospel, yes, eventually because the church was growing the way that it was growing, their widows were being neglected. Now, again, when we talk about these, the difference between the Jews and the Greeks, when we talk about the differences in that of the Jews because they were divided among themselves, then we will understand more because of those people outside of Judah, especially Jerusalem and Judah, they had picked up the Greek way of life. They had a mixture of life, okay? They had picked up the language because you stop just for a moment. The Hebrews had one language, right? That was Aramaic, really. But yet they say, we hear them speak in our own tongues. In other words, in their own dialect. And then here they are outside, and they had different thoughts, different customs and manners that they had picked up from that of the Gentile. The Greek people. And when we stop for a moment and we think about the problem about eating meats, do you think these people outside of Jerusalem and Judea would have that kind of a problem? When Paul goes to Corinth, they didn't see anything. They obeyed the gospel. They didn't see anything wrong with them. But the Jews did. And the reason they saw something wrong with it is because they were eating meat that was offered to that of idols. But to them is nothing. And really, what does Paul tell them? It's nothing because there's no such thing as idols. And so there were those customs and so forth, and we'll see more about that. Any thoughts or questions? We are going over. I guess I give you another break. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, if you're taking it for credit, you send me your notes and I'll send you mine. Lesson number 1. And to those of you who are not taking it for credit, and let me make sure I got everybody that's taking it for credit. I don't see that one here. Rita, you take it for audit, and see you take it audit. Okay, I thought that was right. Joseph,
Credit.
Okay. Ben's credit. James, Jim Hornback is audit. Samuel, well, my fellow from Africa didn't show up. He may be asleep. And Lawrence, you take it for credit. Right? Lawrence.
That is correct.
That is correct. All right, when y'all send me your notes, I'll send you mine. That's the only way you get them now. That's the rule. I've been breaking the rule for the last 2 semesters. I was told when I got to Buford, I started sending people my Ezekiel notes because we were studying Ezekiel, and they said, you're not supposed to do that until we send you ours. So they didn't train. I said, well, I'm sorry, I won't send you anymore. So, okay, Lord willing, we'll meet together next week. Y'all have any questions? All right. All right. God bless. Let me
God bless.
get out of it. All right. We'll see you. We'll see you, Jim, Sunday night when I get back. All right. Stop.